Okay, so, a lot of you have been sitting in these excerpts from Surrounded by Psychopaths, and you want to understand how to actually deal with those kinds of people.
Right.
People who just manipulate and exploit others, and it's not about just putting people in these neat little personality boxes, right? It's way deeper than that. So I've got an expert here with me today, and our mission is to really take a deep dive into all this, give you that sharper awareness and some real practical tools, for protecting yourself, all based on what we're reading in this book.
Yeah, and I think what's so interesting right off the bat is why this author even wrote this book. I mean, he's the one who created the DIC system originally, right? Those color-coded personality profiles. He really intended it to be a helpful tool, but then he starts seeing people twisting it, using it for their own really bad purposes, and he gets concerned. So right away, we're in some pretty serious territory.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And he brings up this whole idea of people who don't fit neatly into any of those DISC categories, the red, yellow, green, or blue. They're more like, I don't know, they mirror whoever they're with. So you might feel like, oh, I really connect with this person. They're just like me. But what's like really key here is the motivation behind that mirroring. It's not like a genuine connection.
You're right. Exactly. He's really clear that this isn't about belonging or empathy or any of that. It's all about manipulation. These individuals it's almost like they instinctively know how to play on other people's behaviors to get what they want. And as the author points out, like repeatedly, they always leave, a trail of chaos and damage in their wake.
Right. And he uses this pretty powerful term for them, no color at all. He actually sees them as like shadows or even like walking frauds because they don't actually have their own real consistent personality.
Right. It's like they're constantly reflecting back whatever's in front of them to their advantage.
So it's a really important distinction, right? Unlike those DISC colors, which are supposed to be about stable personality styles, these individuals are like, I don't know, chameleons, always changing color, but they never have a true color of their own.
It makes you wonder then, like, if someone's constantly acting and mimicking, like, who are they really underneath all that? And the book's argument is that they're not just some blend of all the DISC colors. There's something a lot more concerning. They just don't seem to have that authentic core that drives most people.
And the author actually shares this really compelling and kind of disturbing story about this young guy at one of his lectures. It's a pretty vivid example of how this manipulative pattern can play out. And the consequences are pretty devastating.
Yeah, it's unsettling how much damage this one person caused. I mean, embezzling a bunch of money was just the start. He got one woman fired based on totally made-up harassment claims. Another woman, tragically, she attempts suicide, right? Then he's spreading all these nasty rumors, causing people to go on sick leave, and ultimately the head of the department ends up resigning. But what's so key here is that it's a pattern. He seems charming, has an excuse for everything, but he's systematically causing harm and deflecting blame. Like, that's how psychopathy actually weaponizes social interaction.
And I mean, the audacity is just mind-blowing, right? Like, he learned how to seem so likable, always had some plausible explanation that, conveniently shifted the blame away from him. He even convinced the authorities that the department head had actually suggested the embezzlement. This guy, who had been there forever, almost got prosecuted. It's classic. Exploit weaknesses, play the victim, and just, come out on top.
And even after being caught in this huge web of lies, right, there are no real consequences. The money's gone, and he even lands a new job, like a high-level IT position. It's like the ability to charm and manipulate actually got rewarded.
And the author points out, is like this guy had figured out, quote, how to take advantage of the DISC system. It's like he took something meant for understanding each other and weaponized it, And that brings us to the real danger here. It's not that these individuals are hurting others out of anger or some personal vendetta. They're doing it because, as he puts it, that is what psychopaths do.
Right. It's their nature. Like, they take what they want, use any means necessary, and they just don't care about the consequences for anyone else. Zero remorse.
And thinking bigger picture, it's so important to realize, like, their behavior has this ripple effect. It's not just the direct victims,
Yeah.
The damage they cause spreads out and impacts so many other lives.
Absolutely.
And this is where the whole point of the book comes in. It's all about equipping you, the listener, to actually protect yourself, to understand like what psychopathy really is, recognize those key traits, and I think most importantly, know how to respond when you encounter it. I
Yeah.
mean, you might be thinking, okay, is this just another book about psychopaths? But the author addresses that head on.
Yeah, and one important thing to keep in mind is while the book delves into psychopathy, it really builds upon the familiar foundation of the DISC system, but it's also very upfront about its limitations, especially when we're talking about people who operate outside those normal boundaries,
Right.
those exhibiting psychopathic behavior.
So DISC is about understanding typical personalities.
Yeah.
But this book argues that psychopaths fall outside that whole framework. They're not playing by the same rules because they lack genuine personality traits in the first place.
Right.
And to give you an example of how this manipulative behavior can really play out, the author shares this personal story about a stalker.
Mm.
It's pretty creepy, and it really shows how insidious this kind of dynamic can be.
It is. It's chilling because it starts so innocently. Just, a writer reaching out, wanting some help. But as soon as the author doesn't, engage in this back and forth right away, things escalate fast. Boom, aggressive emails. That's a big red flag right there.
Yeah, but then it takes this super bizarre turn. I mean, the stalker creates this completely fake persona, starts claiming they're in a relationship and getting married.
Mm.
And the accusations are completely outlandish, relationships with almost 100 women, 20 pregnancies in just a few months. I mean, it's wild, right?
Yeah, totally out there.
Yeah.
And the author and his partner, they were bombarded with 50 emails filled with this stuff. This went on for 6 months.
Yeah.
And it caused real problems, especially on social media, with his writer colleagues and all that.
It's scary to think how much impact this one person had on their lives. And then when the police get involved, they find out this person has done the exact same thing to another writer, an older guy, who was really messed up by it. So it's not just some isolated incident, right?
Exactly. It's a pattern. And the author really emphasizes how unbelievable the lying was. Even when confronted with solid proof, this person just denied everything. And then immediately she starts accusing the author of threatening her, which is a classic manipulation tactic, right? Turn the tables, make yourself the victim.
Totally. And this experience actually leads the author to believe that a lot of people with these psychopathic tendencies end up in high positions, especially in government and the military. He thinks it's because they're so focused on status and power and those roles. Well, they just give them the perfect opportunity for that.
Yeah.
Those positions, they have built-in power dynamics, often with less accountability, so those tendencies can really flourish.
It makes sense, right? If you're wired that way, those are positions with incredible control, influence, and impact.
But it's also really important to remember, and the book makes this very clear, most people with psychopathic traits, they don't commit obvious crimes. They're out there, living among us, often hiding in plain sight.
It's like they're blending in perfectly, they seem totally normal, but inside it's a different story. They're operating on a whole other level with a completely different moral compass, And the author even touches on those messengers, the people who manipulate millions by claiming they're in direct contact with God or whatever. It shows you the sheer scale of influence these kinds of individuals can have.
And that brings us to the core characteristics of, people with psychopathic tendencies, as the book lays them out. The first one is this deep callousness and lack of empathy. It's not that they can't understand what other people are feeling. They just don't actually care.
Yeah, it's like they can process the information, someone's in distress, they're suffering, but it doesn't register emotionally. They just don't have that human connection. The book gives this example, they could see someone seriously injured and be like, oh, how interesting. No real emotional response.
And then the second big characteristic is something called pathological lying. So this goes way beyond just telling a little white lie here and there, right?
Yeah.
It's a constant, effortless lying without any shame or guilt, even when there's no reason to lie. And they can change their story on a dime, like it's nothing. For them, lying is as natural as breathing. They'll deny saying something, claim it was a misunderstanding, or even lie just to deceive, It's like a game to them.
The book then dives into the psychopathy checklist. Have you heard of that? It's this tool used to assess the presence and severity of these traits.
Okay, so how does that work?
It's a list of 20 traits, right? Split into 4 categories: interpersonal, affective, lifestyle, and antisocial. And each trait is scored on a scale of 0 to 2, with a maximum total score of 40.
So the higher the score, the more likely they are to exhibit those psychopathic tendencies.
Exactly. And typically, people who are known to have strong psychopathic traits, they often score somewhere between 35 and 40.
Wow. Okay, that makes sense.
But what the author also stresses is that scores between 15 and 20, those are a warning sign, too. It basically means those individuals probably don't have good intentions.
Right. So 15 to 20, definitely pay attention.
And then, 30 or higher, that's serious. It's a strong indication of potential psychopathy and, a greater likelihood of causing significant harm.
So basically, the higher the number, the more dangerous they potentially are.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so painting the picture here. These individuals, they put on a show of being normal, but underneath, it's all cold, calculated thinking. They're not driven by emotions the same way most people are. They just want what they want and will stop at nothing to get it. It's kind of like, a wolf going after a sheep. It's chilling.
Totally. And it can be hard to wrap your head around, right? It can be easy to just be like, no way, people like that don't actually exist. But the book makes it very clear. They do, and they're probably a lot more common than we think.
Yeah, I mean, Robert Hare, who's like a leading researcher in all of this, he estimates that at least 2% of people in the industrialized world meet the criteria for psychopathy based on that checklist. And there's another guy, John Clark. He gives an even higher estimate, like 6% of men, 2% of women.
It's a bit sobering, right?
It is. Like, wow, we're not talking about some rare thing here. These people are out there in our communities, our workplaces, and the book even gives this example of, like, their parasitic lifestyle, this almost automatic expectation that others will pay for them. It's that sense of entitlement, that feeling that they're above the rules that everyone else has to follow.
Exactly. It's like a fundamental disconnect from basic social norms and reciprocity.
Okay, so this brings us to the big question. How do we protect ourselves? And the book gives 3 fundamental steps.
Yeah, it's about increasing self-awareness, learning to actually recognize those psychopathic behaviors, and then really deciding how much you value your own self-worth, and your self-respect, because, as the author says, knowledge is power. In this case, it's a powerful form of protection.
So the first step, increasing self-awareness. What does that really mean?
It's about taking a hard look at yourself, right?
Yeah.
What are your vulnerabilities? What are your blind spots? How do you typically react in different situations? Are you easily swayed by flattery? Do you ignore red flags because you want to see the good in people? Those are the things we need to figure out about ourselves.
Because, I mean, let's face it, we all have those weaknesses, right?
Yeah.
And the book really emphasizes how, for example, flattery, that can be a huge vulnerability that manipulators exploit. And then those who are, obsessed with getting rich quick, those operating in these morally gray zones, they're especially vulnerable to those with psychopathic traits, to all kinds of scams and schemes.
Totally. And to help understand how we see ourselves versus how others see us, the book introduces this model called the Johari window. Basically, it divides our awareness into 4 areas: the public self, the overlooked self, the secret self, and the unknown self.
Okay, break that down for us.
Sure. So the public self, that's stuff both we and other people know about us, right? It's out in the open. Then there's the overlooked self, or blind spots. This is stuff that other people see in us, but we don't. The secret self is stuff we know about ourselves but don't share with others. And the unknown self is stuff that, well, nobody knows, not even us.
So it's like this map of our personality, kind of.
Exactly. And the big takeaway for our listeners is that how we see ourselves isn't always the whole picture. Other people might pick up on things about us that we completely miss. And the author actually shares examples of his own, blue tendencies from DISC, like his perfectionism and his need for really detailed preparation, to make the point that we all have these flaws, these patterns we might not even be aware of.
It makes you think, like, who could give us that honest feedback to help us see those blind spots, right?
Definitely. And that leads to the second step, learning how to spot psychopathic behavior. Now, the book makes this crucial distinction, right? It's not just about whether someone has a few psychopathic traits. There's a difference between that and full-blown psychopathy.
Right. So just because someone, I don't know, seems charming on the surface, or maybe they're a bit impulsive, that doesn't automatically make them a psychopath, right?
Exactly. Those individual traits, you might see them in people with all sorts of different DISC profiles. Someone with a strong yellow might be naturally charming. Someone red could be impulsive. Someone green might struggle with responsibility. It's the whole picture that matters.
So how do we know when it's more than just a personality quirk, when it's like a real red flag?
The book says that when you see a lot of those traits in one person consistently, that's when you need to be concerned. It's the pattern, the accumulation, that's a sign of something more serious.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And, we're all human, right?
Yeah.
We're emotional beings, which makes us vulnerable to manipulation. I mean, we make decisions based on our feelings all the time. And those who are good at manipulating, well, they know exactly how to play on that.
Yeah, it's like influence itself isn't always bad, right? It's part of sales, marketing, all sorts of things. but we have to be aware of how it works and who's doing the influencing.
For sure. And the book talks about some pretty extreme examples of manipulation, like tyrants and people who manipulate financial markets to show just how much damage it can cause. And then there's this more everyday example, that seemingly perfect colleague, the one who's everything for everybody, but actually doesn't do much good work and takes credit for other people's successes. It's manipulation right there in the workplace.
Subtle but effective. And then, interestingly, the book actually lists some professions where people with psychopathic tendencies are more likely to be found. It's jobs with power, money, excitement, control. CEO, lawyer, media, sales, surgeon, journalist, police officer, even religious leader, chef, civil servant. It's not saying everyone in these jobs is like that, of course, but those roles can be very attractive to people with those traits.
Interesting. So kind of like if you're wired that way, those are the jobs that would appeal to you.
Right.
Okay, and then before going into the really specific tactics of how psychopaths manipulate, the book kind of circles back to the DIC colors, red, yellow, green, blue. It's like a reminder of what normal behavior looks like so we can better spot the deviations.
It's about having that baseline, right? So we can see when things are off. So quick recap. Red is all about being fast-paced, decisive, sometimes they come across as challenging. Yellow is happy, creative, extroverted, loves relationships, gets bored with details, but really good communicators. Green is stable, reserved, more introverted, group-oriented, cooperative, good listeners, avoid conflict. And blue is analytical, detail-oriented, structured, precise, sometimes seen as a bit reticent.
Right, so if we understand those normal patterns, it's easier to pick up on when someone's behavior is crossing the line into, manipulative territory or even psychopathy.
Exactly. That's the key.
So bringing it all together, what Erikson is really doing here is taking us beyond just understanding those basic personality types, like with DISC, and helping us to identify those who are, well, they're intentionally manipulating others, right? But they don't even have a real personality of their own underneath it all.
It's a whole other level of complexity,
It is. And we've talked about those warning signs, right? Those red flags to watch out for, and how valuable that psychopathy checklist can be to really see if those concerning traits are there. It's more than just someone being a bit quirky, right?
Yeah, it's about looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly. And then those first steps toward protecting ourselves, increasing our self-awareness, learning to spot those behaviors in others.
Yeah.
So much of it comes down to that, right?
Absolutely. And I think for our listeners, what we've covered today is like a really solid foundation. You wanted to get this knowledge quickly but thoroughly without getting overwhelmed. And this gives you that base for understanding those deeper discussions about manipulation and how to protect yourself.
Totally. And now for you to really think about, consider how influence and maybe even manipulation might be happening in your own life, in your relationships, at work. How do these concepts, these distinctions change how you see those dynamics? And of course, we encourage you to check out Surrounded by Psychopaths and other credible resources to really dive deeper and keep learning how to protect yourself.